I'm sitting with Kay Hedrick from Wilderness Education Project, and we're going to talk about relevance, about making your lessons relevant. And Kay, one of the reasons why is because I think this is an age-old question that I heard students ask when I was in the classroom. I mean, as a student myself, I thought this at times as a student, and I heard it when I was in the school buildings. Students at some point ask this question. I don't even know why we're learning this stuff. Like, why does this matter to me? Or why am I even learning this? It doesn't matter. So, before we dive into some specific examples about how to make learning relevant, like, how do you address that question? How do you address the question of why does this even matter to me?
Well, I think first of all, you really have to, as a teacher, think about why is it important. If you're asking your students to do anything in your classroom, you need to think about what is the reason you're asking your students to do that. And a lot of times we know kind of without thinking about it what that reason is. But if it's not transparent to your students what that reason is or why they need to know something, then you lose them. Unfortunately, I mean, if I'm the same way, if you tell me to do something and I don't see the importance in doing it to me, it doesn't become very important to me. Yeah, and I don't really have a strong desire to learn it or care about why I'm doing it. So I don't
So,
do
if
it.
it doesn't matter to me, then I lose the motivation to be engaged and then I'm lost.
Sometimes I think it's like, why bother? Why do I need to do this? Why do I bother taking the time to do this? But if I can show a kid why they need to know something and why it can be important to them or is important to them, then it gives them that motivation to try. So an
Mm.
example of that would be I had a student several years ago who was a very good football player. And we were doing something in class, and he was like, "Oh, I think it was a grammar lesson of some kind," because I was a language arts teacher. He said, "Why do I need to know this? I'm going to go play pro football. I'm not ever going to use this." And sometimes that requires you may not have thought it through. They ask a question, and you got to be able to. I said, one, you got to be prepared to think on your feet and come up with a reason why
Mhm.
it's important to them. And so I just kind of looked at him and said, "Well, here's the deal. Most athletes have to go through the collegiate system before they get to pro. Typically you're going to have to be able to get into college to get into the collegiate system. And unfortunately, there's a little thing called the ACT that you have to take. And guess what? This that I'm teaching you is on that test.
Mhm.
And so you're going to have to get a certain score on that test to be admitted to college." Now, maybe he wouldn't, but in his mind, that made it relevant to him. It
Yeah.
because he understood why this one little thing was something he needed to know because it might impact his ability to be able to reach the dreams that he had for himself, if
Mm.
that makes sense. So
That's a
sometimes it's not even
powerful
related
example.
to sometimes it's not even related to the content you're or the what you're really wanting them to your ultimate goals. It has to be
Mhm.
aligned to their goals
Yeah.
to be relevant.
Yeah. So what I think is powerful about that example is, I'm thinking, how do I make this specific lesson relevant? And what you just highlighted, that is this reality that there are times where, as an educator, you've got to step back and give them big picture relevance. That not just this is why this specific lesson matters, but why does this entire content area matter? And help them connect that present moment in the classroom with whatever work it is to the bigger picture of what they're pursuing in their life. So that's really great. Can we jump into a specific lesson? Like, so English language arts is your background. Do you have an example, let's say writing, how that might be relevant? And, if I'm an educator teaching a lesson and involves writing, how give an example of how that could be made relevant?
Well, students don't like to write, and unfortunately, writing is one of those things that you really have to practice to reach mastery of. And so when they don't like to do something and you're asking them to do it multiple times so that they can improve, you really kind of have to give them a reason why they need to know that. And so one of the things that I did with writing was I did an anticipation guide,
Mm.
and we would talk about rhetoric and what is rhetoric and why do we need to know rhetoric. And if you could show them the history of rhetoric, and that rhetoric is most oftentimes not taught in countries where people don't have the freedom of to speak,
Mm,
the freedom of being able to communicate, and they see that it's a privilege that they are given this ability to learn how to write and express themselves and to be able to have an argument and to defend themselves. And so when in the process of doing this anticipation guide, they would learn different things about rhetoric, how it became to be, and how it is really taught in places that have democratic societies. And as they become aware of that, then they see a little bit different, see writing a little bit differently.
mm,
If you live somewhere where you don't have the freedom of speech, they don't teach you how to write.
mm,
And so that was an example of something that I did with students to kind of make what I was asking them to do relevant to them. And then as you talk about, building an argument, which a lot of times the writing that we're having them do is doing, you can use that in their day-to-day lives. Like, okay, you're going to go home tonight and you want pizza for supper and your parents don't. How are you going to create an argument with evidence
mm,
that you can back up to get to talk your parents into buying that pizza for dinner instead of whatever it is they want to eat? And so they quickly see that, oh, if I can learn how to argue effectively and do that in the written form or verbal form, then I have a better chance of obtaining the things in my life that I want.
mm.
So again, it's making it about what is it that I want? What are my goals, my dreams, my aspirations? How can this content or this skill help me to do those things?
Yeah. And I think it's really powerful because I like what that first example about the other countries where there's not the freedom of speech, you approached it from this standpoint of, hey, this is something that you have every day that you probably don't even think about being something that's available to you because everybody does it. And then you highlighted the places and spaces in which that same freedom doesn't exist. So it's a reminder of what you have that you hadn't thought of. But then the second example was just showing them and giving them an understanding with an experience from the opposite direction, allowing them to experience something that wasn't a part of what they already had, but making connections that weren't there. You were making this whole invisible, these sets of invisible ideas visible to them and making the connections that they just weren't able to see either through assumption or just not having, information or knowledge about that. So
Another
that's really great.
example of that I used to use, they don't like grammar either.
Mm,
And they're like, why do we need to learn this? And so I had a couple of things that I did with them before we would start really moving into teaching grammar, because that's a part of writing. It's part of
mhm,
being able to communicate well. I have a letter that I gave students that is can be um, what's the word? You can use punctuation. It can be punctuated two different
mm,
ways.
yes.
Exact same words.
Yeah.
And if you punctuate it one way, it's a breakup letter. And if you punctuate it the other way, it's a love letter.
Mm,
And so it becomes really evident to them really when they see the two different ways and they see it's the words didn't change at all, just the
mm,
punctuation changed. And they're like, oh. And I'm like, so you could, depending on how you punctuate this, you can either break up with your girlfriend or you could tell her you love her. And you don't want to do the other one if that's not what you're trying to do. You
yeah.
sure don't want to tell somebody you love them if you're trying to break up with them. But the other thing that I did was I gave them an article. It was actually an article, I think, from the New York Times, but it was an article about a company that lost like so many millions of dollars because of a misplaced comma in a contract.
Mm,
And so they see real quickly, it ties to their emotions, their love. Because, kids
mhm,
when they're in school, love is a big thing,
mhm.
but also tied to money. So two
Yeah,
things that
yeah,
they can relate to, that they can see that, oh, I do need to know how to do this because it can impact me in lots of different ways in my
yeah.
life if I don't do it the correct way.
Mhm,
And so then when they see that, they're like, oh, maybe I do need to know this. I don't want to mess up. But
mm,
I also would talk to them a little bit about, how prior to teaching, I worked in business. And I was in a job where I would hire and fire people. And when you got letters of application in, I said, I sure didn't want to hire somebody that didn't take the time to give me their very best and sent me something that was grammatically incorrect and they didn't spell things right. It told me a lot about their work ethic, but it also told me, so I think it can go a long way to looking at how you present yourself as a person to others and how they view you,
Hmm.
depending on how you use your writing skills or the way you argue or if you spell things correctly. And so it starts to have, they start seeing that, okay, this can be representative of me
Hmm.
and how people view me. And kids at that age want people to view them well.
Yeah.
They have a lot of anxiety about how people view them. And
Yes.
so it
Yeah.
ties into kind of where they are at that point in their lives as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. And that's especially relevant within social media because, you know, many times social media has boiled down to absolutely no punctuation
Mm-hmm.
and having them understand that punctuation matters even in a short set of characters. So, okay, well, what about math? Do you have an example of a math lesson or a math concept that we can make that would be made relevant to our students?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I had a student teacher actually who was a language. She was going to be a language arts teacher. She is now a very, very, very effective language arts
Hmm.
teacher. But she was making, the little packets of rice you get, and that you can cook them in the microwave.
Yeah.
She was making rice for dinner, and she blew up her microwave because she didn't understand fractions.
Hmm.
Because when she read the directions on the package, it said use 1 and 1/2 cups of water. And she misread it and thought it meant to use 1/2 cup. So she only put a half a cup of water in instead of 1.5 cups of water in. And she put it in the microwave and it literally, her microwave blew up. So, just I think in terms of math concepts, just basic things we do with paying our bills or cooking,
Mhm.
life skills that we use every single day are very, very important in math. And so I think you can easily create relevance for students when you're looking at math concepts as you apply it to things that they're going to be doing in their lives every day, or they may already be doing.
Mm. You know what, I'm thinking back to preparing for the lessons and now there's just so much pressure in communicating content because my district might have pacing guides and I'm having to be on pace and like I'm getting told what to teach and we're not going to debate the good and the bad of all that, but the reality is there's a lot of pressure on the lesson and the pace in which I need to go through it. Now, what I'm hearing and understanding is that yes, you have to consider all of the things that you're supposed to consider. And possibly one of the easiest things to forget is the relevance piece. How can I make this relevant to my students? Because I'm thinking, how can I keep up? And I think what we may miss is the understanding of if my students are engaged in the learning because I've made it relevant to them, then we're going to move through the content faster because they're participating rather than me having to fight against the apathy or lack of participation in the subject. I think about my son and he's just an avid fisherman. And we were talking about how he knows things about fishing that most normal people don't know who have been fishing for 25 years. And it's based upon motivation, where he may not be as excited about learning Algebra 2. So it's making those connections between passions and pursuits and needs and understandings and using that information to help the lesson come alive. Do you have a suggestion for a teacher that is wanting, okay, I want to make my lessons more relevant to my students? Do you have any advice for the teacher that's listening to this that says, okay, I want to be more relevant? Maybe what can I do? How can I start?
Well, I think that, it's been known for many years that I think the best teachers really create relationships and build relationships and rapport with their students. And I don't know that you can really gauge what is relevant to your students if you don't know those people.
Mm,
So I think that the first step is you have to get to know your kids and you have to understand who they are and where they are and what are the things that are important to them, because that's where you get at relevance. And this is then secondly, I think to me, if you don't make the lesson relevant to students, you are working awful hard and may not get to what you really your goal is.
mm,
If you can front load with relevance,
mm,
you're always going to be more successful in terms of your lesson, because like I said before, there are many times that I don't, if it's not important to me, why do I care to bother to take the time to try to learn it? But if you can show me why it's important to me or meaningful to me or what I can gain from that, then I'm going to participate. And I don't know how many times I didn't think about relevance and I taught the lesson and kids didn't get it.
mm.
But every time that I thought about making it relevant and gave them that relevance to them in a way that they understood, the lesson was more successful.
So
So
this is a powerful set of information to use, and I appreciate, because my takeaway from what you just said is, if I'll do the work on the front end, it might take a little bit more time to create relevant stories and relevant examples and relevant components in a problem or a writing prompt or whatever it may be. But if I'll do the work on the front end, that might take a little bit longer than just cut and dry stuff that's already pre-made. Then I'm going to make up for it on the backside, because my students are going to be engaged in the lesson, participating in the learning. I'll know how they're progressing, and I won't be dealing with as many behavior problems because they're excited to be a part, and that will actually pay off in the long run. So these are all great examples, and I know there's a lot more examples that you could give. But for right now, educators, administrators, I think it's important to consider the concepts that she's sharing about making your instructional lesson relevant on the specific things that you're doing in each specific lesson. But step back and be ready to tackle that question when it comes to you about why does this even matter, so that you can respond to it in a way that captures their attention and it points them in the right direction of moving forward in a way that's for their best and for their greatest outcomes.